everyone. Welcome to the CSPI podcast. I'm here with Michel Shellenberger. Michael, how are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me, Richard.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. Can you give yourself a little bit of an introduction for our audience?
Sure. I am the best-selling author of Apocalypse Never and San Fransicko, which is my newest book, both published by HarperCollins, and the first two books in a trilogy on why civilization is destroying itself.
Oh, okay. I didn't know the trilogy. This was a trilogy. So, what's the third one going to be on?
I decided I'm not going to talk about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. We'll all.
But I'm telling you the trilogy. I'm releasing the information about the trilogy, so there is a connection between them all.
Okay, yeah. So I read your book San Fransicko. Well, what motivated you to? I haven't read the Apocalypse Never. Is that the you have? That's about nuclear power, right? Or is that just about the environmental movement in general?
Yeah, the subtitle is Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All.
Okay, and so why? What motivated you to write the book about San Fransicko?
Well, to write a book like that, there's a lot of different motivations, but certainly the most basic one is just I'm upset at what's going on out here, and I'm upset by the impact on the people that are on the streets, who are mostly addicts and suffering mental illness. And I'm upset at the ways in which it's dehumanizing to everybody. And I'm upset about the way that it destroys our cities. And I wanted to understand why this was happening and what we can do about it.
Yeah. Are you from San Francisco? Or are you from the Bay Area?
I grew up in a not a super small town anymore, a medium-sized town in Colorado called Greeley, and went to college at a little Quaker school in Indiana, and moved out to California after college in 1993.
Okay, yeah. So I've been to San Francisco maybe 2 or 3 times just for conferences, and it's really shocking. I mean, I come from suburbs of Chicago, and there are parts of Chicago that are pretty bad. They tend to be separated from the nice parts of the city. If you're going to go for a conference of Chicago, in Chicago,
Right.
You're going to be in the downtown area. It's going to be mostly nice, and you're not going to see anything that bad. But San Francisco, I mean, I was in the American Political Science Association, the main political science academic association in the United States, had their conference there. And, you can go 2 blocks down and there's just rows and rows, of homeless people camping in the street. I mean, people are yelling at you. I mean, there's fecal matter in the streets. It's really a shocking experience. I mean, so I don't blame you for wanting to know how this happened. It was that was your experience too, right? Didn't you have a business out there?
Yeah, I've been doing basically, progressive political advocacy and journalism for almost 30 years out here now. A lot of different activist causes over the years. I'm best known for my work on the environment, but in the 90s, I worked on issues around liberalizing drug laws, particularly around needle exchange, which is giving heroin users or other injection drug users clean needles so they don't transmit HIV/AIDS or other diseases. I advocated for marijuana decriminalization and what we call broadly alternative sentencing, which is different, alternatives to just putting people in prison for decades, which is all of which I still support in many ways. But my understanding when I got out of it in the early 2000s was we were looking to do more of a treatment model where, I thought it was acknowledged by everybody, and it wasn't really, is that some amount, if you're going to treat addiction, you can't end any coercion, that you're going to either get coercion through prison or through some other drug treatment, but it's the withdrawal of all really enforcement of laws against people whose addictions are clearly driving, self-destructive and other destructive behaviors in public. And so at bottom, it's just this withdrawing of the enforcement of laws, including ones that address both superficial behaviors and also ones that address the underlying causes.
Yeah. So, I didn't know much about, I knew about the problems in San Francisco. I didn't know much about, there's this debate. And, if you told me, if you told me to guess sort of what the lines are in the debate in San Francisco, like what do the liberal activists want and what other people want, I wouldn't have guessed that the debate is, the way you portray it in the book. So it's, basically the homeless activists in San Francisco, they're against building shelters because they think that homeless need homes. Is that right? They just don't want any shelters at all unless they're the homeless are giving actual, apartments the way, just like some middle class resident in the city might have.
Yeah, you got it. That's a big part of it. I mean, New York, at least up until the pandemic, was able to house almost 99% of its so-called homeless population. And I explain also in the book why the word homelessness is really a propaganda word and is designed to manipulate your brain in ways that are bad for everybody. But basically, I just one of the biggest discoveries of my research was that, yeah, it's the homeless advocates themselves who have demanded that the money go to these really ridiculously expensive apartment units that they can't possibly scale up, as well as before that, the single resident occupancy hotel rooms, which were never demolished, and that in most cities were demolished, which is why, as you describe in Chicago, the downtowns are not, you know, slums basically, but with open air drug scenes and open air drug markets. So, yeah, that was one of the most interesting things about it was that there's really at bottom is a defense of the right to sort of camp anywhere and be sick in public and really not to require treatment, which is just bizarre. It's not something that exists in other countries. It's justified. One of the major pieces of misinformation is that somehow that's the kind of thing that Portugal allows. It's not. It's not what Amsterdam allows or Zurich or any of the other big European cities or any other developed world cities, and many underdeveloped ones as well protect their downtowns and provide treatment for people that are sick, which is what people that are addicted to those drugs are, and whether or not they have an underlying mental illness. So, yeah, I mean, the indictment is pretty serious. It's of the homeless service providers themselves and the advocates who are really, radical left advocates who basically just adopt a posture, as being spokespersons for the homeless, but they're not, because most of the people we call homeless are suffering from, very severe levels of addiction to the world's most intoxicating, addicting, and destructive drugs, and often have untreated mental illness. And so they're not helping anybody. In fact, they're hurting them. And so it's a serious argument, and it's a terrible. It's actually worse than I thought when I got into it.
Yeah, well, I read the book, and it seems like, I wondered, how did San Francisco become like this? And then I read what the homeless advocates in the city believe and how powerful they are, and it makes perfect sense. So they're against arresting the homeless, right? They're against building them shelters. they're also against stopping them from camping in public. They also provide them needles, right? And so you're right. The way you put it, they want to remove every form of coercion, and coercion could it could be even sink or swim, right? It's not like they leave them alone, right? Relieve coercion. It's basically give them drugs, or give them needles, at least let them buy and sell drugs, and don't do much about it, and don't require anything from them. It's like it's not a mystery how this ends up, like how you become a mecca for the homeless with this attitude.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's this, word that academics love to use, which is overdetermined, where you kind of go, why is something happen? What's the cause of it? And you say it's overdetermined, by which you mean there's so many different causes and they all could on their own explain it. And so when they're combined, I just, at the end of it, I was just kind of shrugged my shoulders and was like, yeah, I mean, it could be the fact that San Francisco offers much larger cash welfare benefits. It could be the fact that it offers free housing without requiring, any sobriety or any kind of behavioral requirements. It could be that it doesn't disallow public camping, that there's activists in the city that demand that the police don't enforce laws against basic things like public camping, public defecation, that the ACLU is so powerful in San Francisco. I mean, it sort of goes on and on. At one point, my wife was like, she just goes, so basically you're just saying that San Francisco is because we're so liberal. And I was kind of like, yeah, basically, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, my sister, you know, my whole family's liberal, right? Like we're all progressive. We'd all say progressive. I just decided that that's not a word I could use anymore, but certainly
Right.
liberal, and, in the ways in which, like you would think liberals would be, right? On a whole bunch of things. But, and my sister lives in Boston and works on this issue, actually works on as a service provider, though, on permanent supportive housing. She and her husband is a doc. They come out here and they see what we do and they go, that's not progressive in Boston. So there
Yeah.
is something peculiar to the West Coast. Now, I do see I think I do see it in Philly a lot. They've struggled with this neighborhood called Kensington. In fact, the photo I used when the first day of the publication of the book was a photo from that neighborhood where people are on fentanyl and clearly just, looking like zombies, basically. Which is not a word I love to use, but certainly that is what it looks like. And to sort of deny that it even looks like that would be to be dishonest about what's going on. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I think I've digressed from your question.
No, it's all, it's interesting. I'm like you. I shake my head. It's over determined, but I mean, it's your wife. It seems like is right that it's also. I mean, there is the fundamental cause does seem to be the underlying ideology, which gives you these
Yes.
all these different things.
And it's just taking it too far. I mean, it's also this idea. In some ways, this book is, it's like there's some big surprises, and then there's also stuff where you kind of shake your head and you kind of go, yeah, I could see that. Just taking things too far. Like we should have compassion for people who often did suffer trauma and often were abused as kids, or maybe were orphans, or maybe were foster kids, and maybe they were, just bad things happen, but that doesn't mean that you let them live in a tent on the street, shoot meth and fentanyl if they say that that's what they want.
Yeah.
They might say that that's what they want, but that's the addiction or the mental illness talking. And as a society, you don't accept that. You wouldn't be like, well, you were molested as a girl, and therefore I'm going to let you sit in this tent all day in the middle of, like, right in front of we have a basically open drug camp right in front of City Hall. Like it's like gotten to the point of being like almost like a satire. It's so pathetic. And so, yeah, we've really, we've really allowed this kind of manifestation of kind of guilt and radical left hatred of civilization kind of combine into real harm against vulnerable people out of some idea that we're helping them.
Yeah, I found the part that was in one of the parts that was interesting in your book when you talk about Amsterdam and what they do, and when you say this is not liberal in Boston, it doesn't seem liberal anywhere. So, I mean, did you find any historical or any other? Because you talk about Amsterdam in the book, and it looks like they actually do have some kind of behavioral requirements, right? If the government's going to help you,
Yeah.
right, they require you to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Is there any place in the world besides the West Coast of the United States that does anything close to what cities like San Francisco do?
No, I mean, you can certainly find, you find lack of enforcement of open drug scenes. And so, one of the early discoveries that was exciting for me in this research, and that actually made me happy rather than depressed and cynical, was the discovery that the European cities had all had a phase that we're having now, where basically the left was in power. It was in the 80s. And so the left was in power, and they were radical, and they were saying, to victims, we only give and help. We don't ask for anything in return. It was the exact same thing that progressives are saying now in progressive West Coast cities. And the people themselves revolted against it, just as you might imagine. Like people from the neighborhoods, people who were negatively impacted from it, they demanded of their city councils, but also the federal government. In fact, it was the federal government, mostly in Portugal, that basically just ended what they would call, what European researchers called open drug scenes. Well, we call open drug scenes homeless encampments. It's a euphemism for what is effectively a place where people go to buy and sell and use drugs, usually really hard ones. Heroin was really what it was in all the European cities. It's harder here now because we have meth, and also now the heroin has evolved into fentanyl, and so people are dying. Although that's in some ways bringing the attention, making the crisis more acute. Nonetheless, what was inspiring about discovering that paper is that there's 5 cities, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, Lisbon, Vienna, and Zurich, that all went through the same process of basically there being a political argument. The center right, I think probably with center left, because these were often multi-party systems, the center right then, basically a more centrist governance taking over and saying, no, we're not going to allow that, and using police in addition to social workers. And, everybody, one of the things that progressives did in grossly misrepresenting what those countries did was they cherry picked a few elements of it and then exaggerated them and made them seem like the whole thing. So it is true that in Amsterdam, in Netherlands, there is a small group of heroin users who could not really get with the methadone, which is the synthetic opioid substitute. Now we have even better, we have Suboxone, but they couldn't quite get on methadone. They just really would keep breaking the law basically to use heroin. They were hardcore heroin users. They were a very small percentage of the whole, and they did allow a small number of them. I think it was 150 in Amsterdam, or fewer, my source said. 150 or fewer people that they did that with, and it was only after, really trying to help them quit or just use methadone. So, yeah, I mean, there's, what's inspiring about it is I kind of go, well, that means that we should be able to achieve those reforms. Either that or we're just completely lost as a civilization. I mean, that's my basic argument, is that, like, if you don't solve this, then you just don't deserve to exist. Like, the Chinese might as well take over at that point.
Yeah, so
because you're just letting your most vulnerable people die. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah. So you talk about, the Capitol Hill autonomous zone, Chaz, and then they called it CHOP. And did that ever happen in any European city? Did any city ever, in your readings, did any city ever just
No,
surrender part of it?
I've never heard of that. No, absolutely not. I mean, probably the closest you could get. I mean, you maybe go Quebec, right? Where wasn't there like some but that was like an Indian reservation. There were building takeovers, of course, in the 60s, at universities. But no, the experience I got, I'm very proud. I got the first interview with the police chief, the black female police chief, the first black female police chief of Seattle, Carmen Bess, where she told me the whole story. And she was like, it was a really interesting interview because I don't think I'd ever interviewed somebody who was still so bewildered by what happened. And she'd be like, I still don't understand that. Like, basically somebody on this, the radical left on the Seattle City Council worked with the anarchist protesters who led the takeover, the armed takeover of this, I think it was 4 or 5 block neighborhood. And they convinced the police to abandon the precinct with the apparent consent of the mayor. That part still remains murky. And basically it happened, and she was very upset, the police chief, as you can imagine, and wanted me to know that she did not authorize that. Who exactly was involved. But anyway, it was like, she then was like, I looked this up and this had never happened before. So there was no template. And she was like, I just found myself reading obscure anarchist, texts about this idea. But I mean, it wasn't like anarchists had much experience doing this either. So yeah, last year was quite a year, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah,
I was like, I kind of go, what was that all about? That was crazy last year. Let's never do that again.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. So it's So I mean, that was something I've been thinking about, through our conversation here and through reading your book. Whether it's possibly correcting. I mean, did you see the Portland mayoral election? I think it was last year where Wheeler ran, and the person who ran against him, her name is Sarah Naron or something. I don't know exactly how to pronounce her name, but she was running against Wheeler from the left, and I think she got
Oh,
something like
sure.
and she got something like 40% of the vote. I mean, Wheeler
Right.
barely squeaked it out. So that's a pretty pessimistic story about whether the political system is going to actually ever clean this stuff up on the West Coast.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting though, because honestly, all the mayors were moderate. The San Francisco mayor was a moderate. I mean, really, the whole Democratic Party was still moderate in all these cities, including Seattle, Oakland, San Francisco, LA. And then, the George Floyd, you know, killing happened. And there was I remember thinking a lot last year, why is everything in such a hurry? Like, why are we? I remember by the way, do not capitalize white or black as racial terms in San Francisco. And it's like, as you might imagine, that's like an issue. And, my publisher's great. They're supportive of it. But I disagree with the change. But even as much as my latest thought is, I may switch at some point, but I just was so annoyed by how quickly people felt the need to make that decision. And there was no like kind of conversation in the society, like, okay, should we all just change how we write white and black? Like the language, I felt like the language is, I mean, and obviously this has been a big theme here, is that the language has been, corrupted to it's George Orwell's insight, but it had been really corrupted. And I felt that way with a lot of things, that there was just this kind of panic. Last year was a moral panic. And by moral panic, like the quality of a panic, one of the qualities of it, I think, is that speed. And so, you look at kind of basically after the George Floyd protests, these city councils, there's just a demand to defund the police. And like it became, if not racist, then suspect to actually go, wait a second, can we just, take a minute and think about whether that's a good idea to just defund the police?
Yeah.
And I was so struck by it because I don't think I had ever seen anything quite where the entire society was kind of gripped in a panic, and where the behaviors seemed like the demands. I mean, we see it now on climate, which is this other issue I work on, but certainly there's a sense in which deliberation is actually viewed as suspicious. That the idea that you would want to talk about this, that just shows that you don't care. Like, because if you really cared about George Floyd, you wouldn't want to talk about it, and I hear the same thing on the climate stuff. So anyway, but I know maybe that's a bit of a digression, but that's what your question inspired in me.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's all. I mean, it's all interesting, and it's this is interesting not only as like a question about what's the best way to deal with homelessness or what's the best way to deal with crime. I mean, these are interesting, sort of questions having to do with human psychology and political science and all these other topics, because I'm fascinated by it. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that these are obviously we live in a democracy. Obviously, these cities have democratically elected mayors, and when you say the mayors tend to be moderates, I mean that's frightening, right? It would be scarier if the mayors were just these radicals who happen to gain power, and all you have to do is vote for somebody else next time, right? But it appears that there are, I think one of the interesting things you say in the book is that the homeless advocacy community has more power over these things than the politicians. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, for sure. I mean, it became very clear that the big prey for San Francisco, in terms of understanding why progressives run cities, was clearly the ideas, and I think and then I would say and then maybe the bigger prey than that was the sort of emotional and psychological need for those ideas. And broadly, this is where these two books are, my last two books are, and they'll be part of the third, is that I still feel like I'm looking at the political and sort of social consequences of the death of God, of what Nietzsche called the death of God, and what sociologists call secularization, which is just declining belief in traditional religions. And I'm a very strong believer that in the substitution hypothesis, I guess it's called. Someone told me that recently. I didn't even know what it was called, which is the view that as humans, we need to construct new faiths in the absence of older traditional belief systems. So, but certainly, so you kind of go, well, that's the big factor, and that's not like you can't kind of secularization is something where you're like, those two guys did it, but then you would kind of go, well, who's really the big ideas? And so obviously one of the biggest people in this book is Michel Foucault, the famous French historian who I believe is the most influential intellectual of the last, say, 50 years. Supplanting Marx, bigger than Gramsci, foundational to all of the identity politics, but also foundational to this book and really homelessness, drugs, mental illness, prisons, and policing and crime. And then there were these other folks, the architects of the housing first. Housing first is this idea that you should just give addicts housing without requiring sobriety or abstinence or any progress towards one's personal plan. In the Netherlands, one of the really interesting things that I would see a lot was just, offering your own apartment or your own private room, either in a shelter or somewhere else. But basically, that's what people wanted in exchange for improvements in behavior, whether it's sobriety, recovery, taking your psychiatric meds if you're mentally ill, going to work. And but housing first is this totally radical idea that somehow everybody, including Republicans under George W. Bush, embraced, which is just that they should be given their own housing and no questions asked. So the architects of that policy, I think, are really interesting intellectually. Many of them are in the radical psychiatry tradition. They were actually focused on people suffering mental illness, not addiction. And that makes some of the difference, although really both require the same kind of what is called in the literature contingency, which just means that your ability to get your own room or cash or a gift card or any kind of carrot is contingent on your behavior. So it's actually the dominant, the stuff where there's just like the best empirical evidence for working, both in terms of psychiatric care and addiction, is basically what we used to call behaviorism until behaviorism, got a kind of bad reputation because of its, for a lot of different reasons, but just sort of the rats in a maze, giving them different rewards and punishments. That's still the stuff that shows up as working the best. 12-step also works for a bunch of people, but it's a difficult space. But nonetheless, that's what the radical left has been attacking, is this idea that there should be this contingency management rather than just giving people whatever they want. And I argue that what's behind that is ideological and really spiritual, in the sense that they're trying to turn people they've labeled victims into kind of spiritual figures of whom nothing should be asked and everything given.
Yeah, that reminds me of one part of your book where you talk about there was a white attorney's office in Berkeley, and she was a female, and she had massive posters of black prison leaders on the wall, and then there was a staff of young white women, and each of them had picked one of these black prison leaders as their like sort of patron saint and put them on the wall. Can you talk about that? That's absolutely crazy. That blew my mind.
Well, yeah, and it's funny. It's just strange. It's such a small world. That white female attorney to radical black prisoners was the mother of one of my ex-wife's best friends growing up.
Wow.
And so, I mean, if you live in Berkeley, it's really not that many people, there's like not that many. I was at a friend's house the other day, and she was like, we went on our balcony, and she's like, see that house up there? And I was like, yeah. She goes, that was Robert Oppenheimer's house. I was like, oh my God. It's like the other issue, the founder of nuclear weapons. So It's just a funny city, right? So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, yeah, it's so there's a kind of, at bottom, this is the really dumb part, right? Because there's always like, how dumb is this, And so definitely there's this dumb bad idea that all Black people are victims, and we're all familiar with that, right? Like, and it's just as dumb and bad as it sounds. It's not just wrong in the sense that, like, not all Black people are victims. It's also like bad in the sense that even for people that have had a really, really hard, horrible life, that's not great to be like, you're a victim, essentially a victim, It's actually really terrible. And that's not a controversial view, like psychologically or anything, right? So that's obviously horrible, and yet that is what is behind it. But there's this other part of it, because of course you go, well, if Black people are victims, how come white progressives don't seem to give a darn about the Black victims of homicides, not at the hands of police, but the 30 times more homicides that occur by other civilians, usually other African Americans? Why do white progressives not seem to care about those victims? And the answer is because progressives, really the radical left, they only care about victims of the system because they have ideologically decided that the system is what creates victims, and that without the system, there would be no victims, because they have in mind a utopian alternative, even if they're not totally aware of it. They have in mind a utopian alternative where there are no victims, there is no inequality, there are no poor people, there's no mentally ill people, there's no drug addicted people. All of those things are a consequence of this system that they have in their minds. So, it's really that bad and dumb. What I found at the same time is, when you interview people kind of, and you get into like practical matters, they will concede a lot. Like, so I do quote a fair number of progressives, including people who I'm sure will hate this book, or at least really disagree with it. A fair number of them saying, yeah, we should build enough shelters for homeless people. Like, that's crazy, or we should require psychiatric care for people that are clearly, a threat to themselves and others. So, it is what you said, it's a deeply ideological reaction. And, over the last 20 years, progressives have grown in power. And so you've had the most ideological people come to power and just implement in a variety of ways, in the ways of the overdetermined sense I was saying before, where there were so many laws. I mean, I got to the point where I was like, God, is it the laws, or is it the values? Is it the judges? Is it the voters? Is it the media? It's all of it. Like, it's everything, And so you kind of go, God, it's just, and you see it everywhere. Now, the good news is I do think, like, that people know there's a problem, and there is, like you said, I think you intimated before, I think we're in the midst of the beginning of, but what will grow in strength enormously, a backlash against all this bad woke racist victimology, because people hate it, and it's completely inconsistent with the American creed. It's basically anathema to what Americans, more than any other culture in the world, really value, which is things like hard work and discipline and stoicism and equality under the law, rather than laws that are discriminating on the basis of identity or experience.
Yeah. I don't know how much of that old, American culture remains. The idea, equality before the law. We've had a massive, affirmative action state now for 60 years. It doesn't look like it's changing. Stoicism, I think we've gone sort of to the more emotional side of, of the culture. I think, you have some words to say about the anti-psychiatry people who take it too far and say, there's no mental illness and everyone should be on the streets. But I do think there's been a sort of I do think there's places where psychology and psychiatry have gone a little bit too far. So yeah, I don't know how much of that old American culture is actually left at this point.
I think the best. Joe Rogan asked me what I thought the best argument against this book was, and that was it. It's just that we're doomed. The book opens and closes with that issue. Actually, it opens with me saying to my wife, I don't know if this book can be anything more than a warning of non-progressive cities what not to do. and she was like, you got to do better than that. You got to give us something. So I do propose, basically the big idea is, these things I've been mentioning: contingency, shelter first, treatment first, housing earned, plus universal psychiatry. That I do think is, if you look at it, open-mindedly, I don't think anybody can look at that and be like, oh, that's right wing or left wing. It's just something that you need to do, like they do in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
And so part of me, yeah, I guess if I'm idealistic, it's for a pragmatic approach to this. But I mean, I end the book expressing my profound concerns for our country. I don't think that this is a small issue. I think that we're definitely in the worst way. A friend of mine who had a big influence on my thinking for both of these books, Mike Lind, who co-founder of New America Foundation and also a very heterodoxical person, he was like, he's a good historian too. He's always like, we're just in the 70s. Like, that's what this is. It's all just the 1970s again. And I mean, I see what he means. It's not quite stagflation yet, but it is so similar, like foreign policy, the kind of the leadership being totally lost. And so, you kind of go, America, I don't personally think America is done yet. Like, I just kind of go, that seems, I mean, and partly because I'm a Gen Xer, so in the late 80s, there was this conversation about whether the U.S. was over, and then we had a pretty darn good, I mean, you had a lot of progress over the last 30 years in a lot of ways. So part of me just doesn't believe that this could possibly be the end of the American empire and that we're all going to split into two. And I don't believe it, in part because, people still want to live here. It's still a spectacular place. I mean, I just spent the last 5 years traveling a lot, including to Asia, Europe, Africa, Latin America. And the United States is still amazing. Like, it's still such an economic powerhouse. And so, that's where I kind of go, we'll get it together. I don't know what it'll look like exactly, but it's hard for me to think that this is really like end times for us either.
Yeah. I want to go back to when you talked about the ideas that have sort of taken over, and especially in places like San Francisco. How do you think about, because there's another way to look at it, right? The idea, the ideas are there. And how do you think about the question of whether ideas have influence, or it's just simply that this is sort of a money-making scheme, right? The fact that, one thing interesting that you bring up is that a lot of the social services are privatized, right? So there's huge profits to be made. And those people, if their paycheck depends on it, they'll seize on whatever ideas or whatever ideology they need to basically keep the resources flowing. How do you think about differentiating between the idea aspect of it and sort of the business model of the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I mean, there's, I think it's fair to call a lot of these I quote sort of the most academically respected expert on homelessness, this guy named Dennis Culhane from University of Pennsylvania, basically saying the service providers do a terrible job, and so what's not me, I'm just like, I'm quoting the guy that everybody says is like the top guy on this, and it's very liberal, very progressive even. And he's like, they do a terrible job, and part of me agrees. I know a lot of folks in that sector. My sister works in it. I don't think my sister does a terrible job. I think they do a better job in Massachusetts. So some of it is clearly, it's similar to the debate over single payer healthcare. I kind of go, at a certain point, you're like, I mean, one of the things I discovered is very interesting is that the Netherlands does not have socialized medicine. And again, I hold up the Netherlands as kind of, I would say, the gold standard. I mean, maybe you would say, some people might say Frankfurt does a better job, or Zurich or something, or, I mean, certainly Portugal, it's slightly different, but still, you kind of go, this is one of the best systems in the world for treating addiction and mental illness. And I visited the shelters, and they look luxurious compared to ours. I kind of go, you don't have to have, socialized medicine. You don't have to have single payer. So you may always have for-profit players in the space. And I think I'm fine with that as a pragmatic person. I think if you see evidence, and the Times has done these pieces, New York Times has done pieces in the last few weeks on a homeless housing provider who makes, a lot of money, and he hires his family as kind of crony. Yeah, I mean, you don't want that. But, the Dutch government does a huge contract with Salvation Army. Salvation Army has 2,000 people. So it doesn't necessarily that it's the either the for-profit or the nonprofit or the governmental structures that are the problem. The problem, in my view, is that you have this redundancy and gaps, what they call, fragmentation, what academics call fragmentation of the social safety net, where, you can get out of rehab and have nowhere to go and end up on the street using drugs and maybe overdosing and dying because your tolerance has declined. So it's that kind of stuff. You get out of prison, but where's your job? Like, where are you going? And America just does a terrible job on the in-between space, on the gray areas. We're very like, it's either prison or nothing,
Yeah.
and I'm like, God, we have ankle bracelets. Ankle bracelets are like genius. Like, you could be a dad to your kids at home with an ankle bracelet and take care of your kids or whatever, and you don't have to be in prison, but yet you're also like, you can't drive down to the open air drug market and buy heroin. That seems like a pretty good deal for everybody involved, right? So there's that stuff's all missing. I just think you need a hierarchy. I just kind of go, that's how we get stuff done in general. I mean, the Dutch certainly have that. It's, whereas here it's like, well, we gave somebody a grant for that.
Yeah.
It's like, well, we gave out a bunch of grants, and it's like, well, wait a second, but what are you doing to drive down the number of addicts? Like, if you're like you go, well, why are these crimes occurring? Well, because they're addicts. Okay, so what are we doing to treat the addiction? Well, the answer is nothing.
Yeah.
They're just enabling and servicing it. So to even describe, it's like, so I realized pretty early on, even the question of the question of how much money we're spending, it's almost like it's the wrong first question. It's a good question to ask, but you first have to understand that the system is not doing the things to drive down the costs, because that would involve making people get rehab rather than just use drugs on the street.
Yeah. I mean, I think in America, I mean, we get so distracted, I mean, by the big government versus small government debate. And, there's something to that. But in my mind, it's been subsumed by, there's a couple sort of more fundamental things, right? There's, incentives. Does policy take into account incentives or not, right? So you can have a big government that says, get off the streets and get off drugs and we're going to help you. Or you could have a big government that just, gives you needles and, lets you, go about your business, right? So I think that the big government versus small government thing, I think, has sort of distracted us from just the lack of competence and sort of design and institutions that we have in this country. And yeah, you talk about the central, I think that the fact that nobody in charge is a real problem, right? Like theoretically, you'd want that to be, the mayor. Practically, it doesn't seem to work like that. I mean, you have the mayor, you have you have the governor who you could blame or not blame for stuff. You have the president, even though he's probably less influential than what's happening in, California. But you have this fragmented government at the local level, and then you have it fragmented between different levels of government, right? And I think, our system has done such a good job of sort of limiting power that it's sort of like everyone is in a box, but there's nobody sort of overseeing the whole thing. Like, who is the most blameworthy or praiseworthy person for what's happening in San Francisco? And there's just no clear answer to that, right? You have the advocacy community, you have the ACLU, the homeless organizations, you have like the public sector unions, you have these interests that are always there. Right, and they're full-time influence in government, and you have these elected officials who just they go up there and they say a few words and then they're gone and nothing really changes. Right, there's something really really broken with the system here.
Yeah, there is, and I think the system is broken, and so you need new institutions. I'm calling it Cal Psych, and it would be CEO reports to the governor. He's she or he is a public, like highly paid, best in class, CEO of this huge statewide, institution, but it might do subcontracts, with different non-profit service providers, but they would be contracts, and it's not, and the incentives, as you said, would be aligned around, reducing addiction, not enabling addiction. And it could contract out to, how, we call it residential care, we used to call it halfway houses, but everything, shelters. Because I think part of it is you should not be treated often in the same place where you were arrested. If you're arrested in an open air drug scene, you should not get your rehab there. You should get your rehab somewhere pretty far away, so that's not a temptation for you. But I do think there's this other part of it, which is that there does need to be a change in the entire country and society around addiction and mental illness, and that the libertarianism in us, the overhang of the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the ongoing stupidity of the Britney Spears conservacy case, just lack of clarity about what it is we're talking about, I think has created a culture of the institutions, institutional culture, but also institutional structures where people don't understand, because they don't understand that you need to require treatment. I mean, there's this, on the one hand, there's something very strong in the culture, which is interventions. And we even have a TV show about interventions, and most of us have friends, friends or family who have had substance abuse problems. Very few of us don't know anybody, right, that hasn't had a problem. One of my best friends from high school right now has an active problem, and it's hard. I actually been feeling like I haven't been a very good friend in a lot of ways because I haven't known how to deal with it. But he clearly needs, and has even sort of admitted to it, that he needs some kind of oversight, some kind of probation, some kind of care that is kind of providing some of that enforcement and discipline that he needs. And I just think that for a variety of reasons that I describe in the book, we don't have that, and there's sort of cultural and political reasons for it. But until we have it, I think we're going to have this confusion. It needs to exist in multiple institutions and have the support of our political officials and voters as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's strange because, you say, there's this sort of libertarian attitude, but you think about it, you talk about that person you knew who wanted sort of probation or wanted somebody,
right.
In a pure libertarian society, you could sign a contract, that says, I'm going to, sell myself off to slavery, right? Or sell myself off to some kind of probation, or just, have myself, take commands from somebody else, right? And the courts in the U.S., would not enforce such a contract, right? And so it's interesting, right? It's interesting where the government steps in, right? Because there are sort of things we don't let people do that, would be consistent with a sort of a libertarian philosophy and maybe would help people. But we don't allow that stuff. And, that I think that's,
yeah. And some of it's like the hardest is the people with things like schizophrenia. And I tell a story in the book where one of the main character heroes in the Netherlands describes kind of grabbing a guy with schizophrenia by the lapels and being like, you got to go into the hospital. And I kept the story in because it's kind of off the books, and I kept the story in the book, even though my research assistants and colleagues raised some concerns about it. And I wanted to keep it in to kind of go, that kind of thing is often justified as an alternative to what else might follow, including assault or the person doing something really harmful and then getting much worse medical care, and it's spiraling into jail or prison or something much more denying of his civil liberties. So there's some stuff in there that I want to point at that's messy. There is still struggles in the Netherlands where there's some people that are just too soft, and I think we could all imagine many situations in the United States where we have knuckle draggers who are a little bit too rough with people. But it seems like either way you kind of go, and this is why I'm so pro-police at this point. I mean, part of my optimism out of the book was just I became very pro-police, because I go, if you're worried about obviously preventing crime, including the mother of all crimes, which is homicide, the evidence for police is really strong. It's not like, there's a bunch of scholarly disagreement. There's really good evidence that more police, and yes, better policing, but better policing requires more policing, that was something that we needed. And I kind of go the same way with a lot of stuff, which is just like, if you want to have better outcomes, then you have to have these empowered public servants or people in some way or another serving the public and serving the people that are affected to be able to do their jobs, and not, so I just think, we've just been really black and white about how we approach this population in general.
Yeah. I mean, I like how you're not coming with just a simple conservative solution. It's, you think centralization, right, is necessary to get something done. Yeah, this is so. I mean, when you talk to people in San Francisco, I mean, you talk to a lot of people. There's a lot of data in this book, and there's a lot of there's a lot of data, but there's a lot of interviews and anecdotes and stories of people you've got to know. Are there? I mean, is what's your sense of where public opinion is? Are they still? Do you think that people are still along the lines of we just haven't done enough to help the homeless, or do you really feel that there's sort of a shift going on towards a healthier direction?
Right after this, I'm talking to the San Francisco grand jury and explaining why that basically people's liberties are being deprived. I am an author. I'm also an activist. And so I've been advocating with parents of kids killed by fentanyl, parents with kids addicted to fentanyl on the street, recovering addicts, community residents. We have a statewide coalition called the California Peace Coalition. And, honestly, we're in the midst of a big argument here over how to deal with the drug crisis. And I think that the legitimacy of the ancien regime, in this case, the basically drug liberalization, harm reduction, housing first, it's obviously, we're calling it into question. So I think we're still in some of the early stages of both the backlash against the wokeism, but I view that backlash as also part of what San Fransicko is about, which is basically saying we have to get back to some basics here. So yeah, I mean, I think in terms of even my own personal relationships with progressives, the guys I play soccer with in Berkeley, the people I've known for a long time, I think they're absorbing this book right now, and I think I think it helps them to listen to me on Rogan and on podcasts and kind of explain what I'm describing, because I think it's easy in short form, sound bites to hear something that's not the case. I'm still the same progressive in the ways that I don't want mass incarceration. And I just happen to believe that we don't have to choose between mass incarceration and mass homelessness, and that we can have in many ways the progressive social safety net that progressives have long wanted, but it does require that we hold people accountable for their behaviors, including when they break the law.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I mean, that's at least we're ending, I think, on an optimistic note. I mean, I wish you the best of luck. I hope San Francisco again becomes a livable city at some point, and good luck in your future writing and your future activism. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thanks, Richard. I enjoyed it.